Good evening, everyone. It hasn't been that interesting of a week out here on the farm until today. The entire eastern corn belt had what I would call a weather anomaly. Well, more of an oddity than an anomaly, but the entire eastern corn belt had a frost this morning. At dawn this morning, a lot of these fields showed the signs of frost. Grass had ice particles on them, and there's some damage out in a few of our fields. This is a very rare but nice opportunity to talk agronomically with you about the effects of frost on corn and soybean plants and why they play a major factor in people's decisions on when to plant and when not to plant. A frost in the first week of May, although highly unlikely, is not something we haven't seen before. It has not occurred on our farm in well over a decade. I honestly can't tell you off the top of my head the last time we've had a frost in May, especially one that had notable damage out on our farm. Logically, as you go farther north, frost damage is something that farmers have to take much more consideration in at the beginning and the end of the season. Frost is the one thing that boundaries both sides of a crop season that makes significant impacts on our yields and our ability to plant a certain day length and variety of corn and soybeans. For the most part, I would say that we dodged a bullet on this frost. It could have been much worse on our corn fields and especially our soybean fields across the road that are getting close to V1-ish to V2. We could have seen irreparable damage out in those fields from a frost that would have required replanting. We're out here in our first planted field of corn. It's our tallest field of corn on our sandiest soil, which is most susceptible to frost damage early in the morning. The largest majority of this cornfield seems to be in okay condition. There are spots in cornfields that are more susceptible to frost damage that do not have the heat protection that other areas of the field offer. The center of the field typically is not as much of an issue if the temperature is adequate in the soil, as it's surrounded by ground that's been warmed up over time. However, as you get closer to areas such as field edges with ditches, they do not have the same temperature buffer that the middle of the field has. This field in particular is more susceptible to a frost because it's a sandier soil. On a microscopic level, sandy soils have much larger pore spaces than silts and clays. Sandier soils have more room for air to circulate around the particles and lower the temperature of the soil quicker, resulting in much less of a buffer for the crops above. When dealing with frost in a corn crop, it's very important to consider the growth stage. As you can see in this plant right here, this corn is just now about to enter V2. Following the emergence of the seed leaf, each new leaf is another V stage in the corn's growth. As the collar is established, that is when it reaches the next stage. What is really important about the vegetative stage of the corn crop, especially when frost is present, is that prior to V5, the growing point of this corn plant is below ground. Any damage that is done to the above ground portion of this plant can actually be rejuvenated from below because that growing point is below the surface and still pushing plant matter out. Once you reach V5, the growing point is emerged out of the ground, and a frost at that point would completely eliminate this corn plant. As you can see, we're getting very close to V2 on this plant, but we're not quite there. If we were in V5 and this temperature had rolled in, I'd be a lot more worried than we are right now. Right along the edge of the field is where the majority of our frost damage is presenting itself. The lack of temperature buffer offered by the ditch created an environment where the lower temperatures could thrive and cause damage to our above ground plants here. As you can see, here's a plant that's about 90 inches or so from the edge of the ditch. It is already showing signs of damage from the frost we had this morning. You can see this leaf tissue here is very soft, discolored. That's a telltale example of frost damage. Over the next few days, this lighter discolored tissue will die off. However, the majority of this plant looks like it's going to survive. Here's another plant right next to it. A lower leaf is showing obvious signs. In this field, it's very sporadic what's taken damage and what's not. This is our first leaf on the plant died here. This entire row of corn is suffering from the damages of the frost. You can see this one suffered a lot of damage. However, the base of the plant is still in good health. The leaves are going to die off. However, the stem has not really softened up at all, which tells me that this corn plant is actually still alive, probably an inch up off of the ground. Frost damage is easy to spot where it causes a sponge-like feeling in your plants. I mean, there's no rigidity to these leaves. Whereas you go to a plant that's a little bit healthier, the leaves have a little bit more structure to them. Here's another corn plant, a little bit farther in the field. You can see that the frost absolutely leveled it off. The plant right next to it is perfectly fine. It's crazy the diversity out in the field as to where the frost was more severe and where it wasn't. Both sides of this plant are not showing any signs of frost damage, and the one in the middle is gone. Here's another plant in the area. has some obvious frost damage on the higher up plant matter. To give you a better idea on how much we're concerned about this, I'm gonna find the worst plant I can out here in the field, dig it up with the shovel, and we're gonna see whether or not the growing point's alive. If that's alive and it's the worst looking plant out here, I'd venture to say that everything else is fine. The center of the field is not showing any issues. The edges though are a little bit under the weather. I would say that this guy right here is definitely our most sickly looking plant out in this field. We're gonna dig it up and see what kind of shape it's in. You see it's soft all the way to the base of the plant. As you can see, we've loosened up the soil here a little bit on this plant. The minute you get below the soil surface, there is no problem with this plant at all. At the current stage of this plant, the growing point is about right in this area. That is perfectly fine. Over the next few days, this tissue will all fall off the plant and new plant tissue will emerge from here with little to no impact on yield. That is one of the beautiful parts about the corn plant at this stage in its life. A frost on it has shown little to no yield loss. Now, I'm not saying that that's a certainty that there isn't going to be any yield loss. We may see a little bit off the top end, but a few percentage versus losing this entire cornfield is a price we're willing to pay to get it in the ground and get it to yield well. That was by far the worst plant out in the field, so I would speculate that the rest of the field is going to be just fine. However, this has been a very interesting development for our corn crop this year, something we haven't seen in ages. These little ones are what I'm a little bit unsure about. Unlike corn, the growing point on a soybean plant is above ground from the minute it emerges. A frost at any time will kill a soybean plant completely. There's no saving a plant. There's no rejuvenation, nothing. This plant dies if it gets a killing frost. The lack of growing point protection in a soybean field is one of the main reasons that they've been planted later than corn for ages. They're a very resilient little crop, but if temperatures get cold enough, this entire field will die. I have yet to see conclusive evidence out here that there's economic damage to the soybean field. Symptoms may not show up for another 2 to 3 days, if not a whole week. The one aspect of these plants right now that is giving me some worry is the fact that they're leaning over like this. You can see that this plant is bent over at the ground. However, it's rigid right there. It may be resilient enough to recover from this damage. These plants could be dead. A lot of our soybeans in this field out here are showing similar signs. I'm not quite sure if that's conclusive evidence that this field is going to be hurt or not. The leaves have not started to discolor as of yet. Although they're leaning over, there seems to be no discoloration at the soil surface to indicate that the plants are dead. We will probably know whether or not in the next week whether or not this field is in trouble or if it'll be okay. It is irrelevant, but these soybeans are right at V1. The first trifoliate has unfolded on top of the dicotyledons. It does appear that there is some leaf tissue damage from the frost. That does not necessarily mean that the plant will die. It's not a good sign. We'll see what time does. One very interesting aspect about corn and soybean plants is that they do produce a natural solute inside of their tissue to help act as an antifreeze of sorts to protect against very cool temperatures. This buys them time. However, the typical standard for corn and soybean plants to die is 28 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 to 4 hours. At those ambient temperatures, you can kiss all of your above ground plant material bye. Very hit or miss across here. I'm hopeful that these plants can all survive. I would not be surprised if there was not permanent damage done to them. One of the main advantages that a soybean field has when compared to a corn field is that they can take a very large loss in plant quantity out in the field and still be at an economical level. If you lose 20 to 30% of your soybean field sporadically, depending on how thick you plant them, you can still be at a population that will not limit your yield potential. If that were to happen out in a cornfield, you will definitely be limiting your yield potential, as corn only has so much room to adapt to its conditions and flex its ears. Soybeans will vegetate and adapt accordingly to the stand out in their field. Obviously, if the population gets low enough, typically when you start to get under 100,000 plants per acre in a soybean field, you're really running tight on the quantity of plants you can have out there without losing yield. I have seen data where they can produce good crops, 100,000 plants per acre. That's unlikely for us, especially considering that if we put 165,000 plants out here to start with and we ended up with 100,000, we would likely end up with pockets out in the field where a vast majority of the plant dies and other regions of the field where there's a lot of plants. So it's still probably going to justify replanting if we lose a large portion of this field. As of today, there's really nothing we can do other than give the plants a little bit of time and see the outcome of this frost. It may be 1 to 7 days before we're able to tell if there's enough injury out in the field to have economical justification for replanting or other special considerations going on in the season. I will say that modern hybrids and varieties are extremely vigorous and resilient. They have the ability to overcome conditions that we don't necessarily believe is possible. You give these plants a few days, they may snap out of these sickly conditions and be back to the races with warm weather. Although most of this corn and soybeans did not suffer any physical injury from these cool conditions, they do not enjoy 30-degree weather. We need a minimum of 50 degrees to encourage these crops to grow and take up nutrients so they can get a good start on the vegetative growth to produce a massive crop. The one thing our corn needs right now is warm weather. It really does not look that good. It's not to the point in its life cycle yet where it really starts to green up, and we're not going to get there at 40-degree nights. The best thing we can do at this point in time is to continue to wish for warm weather and wait it out and see what happens. I hope you guys enjoyed this little tidbit of information on frost damage in our corn and soybean crop. I'll keep you guys posted over the next week or so as we track the development of further symptoms of the cool weather and its effect on our crop. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hit that like button if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and comment if you have any questions. Have a great night, guys. Peace!